some lunch. Afterwards, we're going to be doing some group discussions again, very similar to yesterday, on training the trainer sessions, and then the future goals for our Indigenous 2SLGBTQQIA youth in Northern Ontario. So I'm really looking forward to those discussions today. So before we begin, I would like to introduce the two elders that are with us today. So we have Monet Chikabe, if you can raise your hands. Everyone knows that she's wonderful. And we also have Stands in Water Sutherland right here. They're wonderful Two-Spirit elders here, and they have offered themselves for anyone that wants to speak at any point in time. They're willing to go to a private section in the building, and if you feel like you need to discuss something, or if there was something that you needed guidance on, they're more than willing to offer that to you today. So before we begin, I would like to invite our Two-Spirit elders to come up and open us up in a good way. Come on up, you guys.
Oh. There.
Okay.
You go first.
Okay. Hi, Jay. Good morning. I would like to say Kichimigwech to the Great Spirit for giving us another day. We would like to say thank you for giving us all the teachings yesterday and on the teachings for that's going to come today. We would like to say Kichimigwech Kishimendo. I'd like to say a little prayer. Yesterday I said my prayer in Cree. Today I'm going to say it in English. Good morning, Great Spirit. Thank you for all that you have provided for us yesterday, and we look forward to today. Thank you for waking me up this morning, and thank you for giving me time to face the east so that I may welcome our spirits from the eastern direction to come and bless us. I thank you for giving us the opportunity to, or give us the good thoughts so that we may have good thinking today. And we pray for our eyes so that we may see good things. We pray for our ears so that we may hear good things. We pray for our mind so we have good thoughts. We also thank you for all that you have provided for us so that we may walk gently and softly on Mother Earth. We thank you for the animals, for providing all the food, clothing, and housing that we need to survive in this world. We thank you for all the birds, for providing us the meat, the eggs, and the feathers. Jimigwich. And we said thank you to all the fish, all the swimming ones, for providing us food. And we thank you for all the plants, berries, leaves, trees, and for providing us food and giving us medicines so we may carry on softly on Mother Earth in a healthy way. We thank you for Mother Earth. We thank you for our grandfathers, the rocks. We thank you for the wind, the fire, sun, moon, stars, and northern lights. Beautiful northern lights the other day. And we ask that that we create a really good spirit for us today, and that we will ask for your blessings and guide our spirits in a good way. Thank you, Great Spirit. Oh.
Menugishep, good morning. Miigwech ki bin shiang uma chagagi katiang nongum kagi shigak. We jishnamo ene chipimutuang bimatswin na nongum. Chuichi tiang kawi shichikiang nongum kagi shigak. Miigwech manetu kakingagongi min shiang. Sagi tuin shawena moen kakinagagon. Great Spirit, we thank you for the gifts of life you give us. Thank you for the gifts of strength and courage to do what we need to do today. Give us this day to share our lives with each other as we go on today, and help each other and listen to one another and be good to yourselves. And I'll be good to myself. Thank you, Great Spirit, for everything. Miigwech.
Miigwech elders. So we're going to begin with our first speaker, Riley Yesno. So Riley Yesno is a queer Anishinaabe scholar, writer, and public intellectual from Ibanmitung. Fort Hope. I should have asked you, you were right beside me. How to say that, my apologies. She is highly sought after for her words and analysis, calling a rising powerhouse by the Toronto Star. She has been a contributor and commenter for some of the largest media outlets in Canada and the world, including the New York Times, BBC World News, the Globe and Mail, and CBC National News. Riley has traveled the globe speaking at international renowned institutes and events, including the UN climate negotiations, the Stockholm Forum of Gender Equality, TEDx stages, and many others. Her major project right now is teaching at Toronto Metropolitan University, where she finishes her PhD at the University of Toronto, studying Indigenous Canadian politics, and is a Vinier scholar. So help me in welcoming this baddie.
What a nice introduction. I don't think I've ever been called a baddie in my introduction before. So good. Hello, folks. Folks at Engaged, I have a PowerPoint. Am I supposed to email that to you? Yes. Okay. I will. While I do that, I will say hello here. I'll just give you folks my laptop, so you can send it to yourselves. Okay, so as was mentioned in the introduction, I am Anishinaabe. I'm from Fort Hope, but grew up mostly in Thunder Bay. And now I live and I work in Toronto, but I'm looking for every excuse to get back to Thunder Bay. So thank you, Nan, for always facilitating that for me. Today, I talked with Celine, and I think the plan is for our session, it's a little bit of a longer session, is that I'm going to give my first presentation. Since we're a smaller group, I'm hoping I can make it a little bit less lecture style and a little bit more interactive. But I try, there's some like peaks and valleys in it, I'll say, and I try and end at a high point. But in case I don't do so successfully, I know that Celine is going to come in and talk to you in the second half about queer Indigenous people killing it and Indigenous futurisms, and make sure that we leave the space in a really good positive note. So that is kind of the flow for today, if just so everybody is aware. Is it not working? Oh, okay. It says you should be editor. Okay. Okay, no, it's all good. It's all good. I see. Share, perfect. So I am starting this presentation. I figured what I'll do first is I want to first talk a little bit about the nature of identity, how we talk about identity today in some academic terms, but try and make them like not as academic. And then I want to move on to looking at Two-Spirit identity and Indigenous queer identity specifically. Where does it come from? Those colonial underpinnings as per the title of this session. Moving into some struggles, contemporary struggles and advocacy work that's happening, and then ending on the futures, which will be the second half. So if that sounds like a plan, I think I'll jump in to the presentation. So, and I see Andrew is on there. Lovely. Thank you so much. So I'm going to get you to take me. Oh yeah. Also, I use she, her pronouns. And I have attached my social media handle there in case you all want to connect after this. So that's where you can reach me. Riley, yes, no, maybe. I say the joke for people first so that they don't get to. So when you get a sec, I'll take me to slide 3, please. Yeah, perfect. So one of the like big buzzword terms, like if you see like those Instagram infographic type things that you'll see come up again and again, is intersectionality. It's a really, have folks, you've come across this term before, right? Maybe seeing some nods. Okay, so it's a really useful term created by a Black academic named Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, but it is often like misused in ways that make it, I think, less effective. So next slide, please. So Kimberly Crenshaw created this term because she's a lawyer, and she was finding in her studies that, you know, she couldn't easily describe the experience of Black women in the legal system because of the way that they weren't just facing, you know, racial prejudice by the system. They were also facing misogyny. And that was in itself like a unique experience. And so right here, I wrote that, you know, they seem to forget that Black women are both Black and female and women, and thus subject to discrimination on the basis of both race and gender, and most often a combination of the two that are inextricable rather. Next slide. And so she created the term intersectionality to be like a way to think about, called an analytical framework, to understand how those pieces of people's identities overlap to create either privilege or oppression, advantage or disadvantage. So sometimes when people say like, oh, because of my intersectional identity, that doesn't actually make sense with the way that she created it, right? All of us have intersectional identities. We are not just like one thing at any time. So we would all have intersectional identities. If you wanted to take an intersectional view of something, you would be looking at the ways that those identities either overlap or don't. And so it's also not about adding one aspect of an identity to another. So like, you can't say like, I want this event to be intersectional, because that once again, doesn't make sense. We're all inherently intersectional. It's just about a way to recognize where exactly those intersections are and what sort of power is wrapped up in them. And so in recent years, it's like become this way to talk about representation more than it is about power. And so Kimberly Crenshaw has this quote where she's basically bashing all of us who do that and saying, it's not really concerned with shallow questions of identity or representation, but more interested in the deep, structural, systematic questions about discrimination and equality. Next slide, please. So this is another thing I find really useful when talking about identity, because while we have, those overlapping layers of identity. They're not always visible. And so the social identity wheel is like really useful. I find, especially if folks want to like use this resource when you're explaining, like I often have to like a group of like businessmen, like, so I'll do like consultations where they want to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. And you'll never, you can probably guess the amount of times that these like white CEO male execs are like, but I grew up poor and like people don't understand that. Like I come from this like background and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, let me introduce you to the social identity wheel, which is to say that so many aspects of our identity are core and internal and unchanging. That doesn't always necessarily mean that they go to that external wheel there, which is the stuff that's visible to the external world. They're all real, they're all parts of you, but it's to understand the way you walk in the world as opposed to who you are in yourself, right? So on the inside there, you might see your age, your race or your ethnicity, your gender identity. Gender expression, I think, would be one that goes more on the outer wheel as opposed to the inner one as it is here. And so on the outside, like you might more easily be able to see people's income, if they have any sort of religious indication, all of those sorts of things. And it's just a way to understand in maybe a really flat way, but I think an accessible way, how identity is both, an internal phenomenon and an external part of the world. And the businessmen are often like, wow, I didn't ever think about that, that people judge me based on what I present. And I'm like, yeah. So this is really useful, I think, in explaining that in that regard. All right, next slide, please. So 2S 101, I call this. I think it's a little bit deeper than a 101, but it's this is a presentation that I've added to over the years. So you'll get from like the very basic, like where does the term come from, into like the history. So next slide. So starting pre-colonization, this is from the report of the sub-working group of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit Inquiry, which I believe Elder Mani was also in the working group. So thank you, Mani, for some of these resources I'm using here today. So the working group found that there is evidence that over 2/3 of the 200 indigenous languages spoken in North America, so about 150, had terms that were used to identify individuals who are neither man nor woman. And in some languages, we know that there are upwards of like 11, 12 different types of words for identity. And in today's context, we might have, male and female, non-binary, and increasingly like genderqueer or agender. But this is just to say that, and people sometimes think that that's like really wild and we're creating new words out of nowhere, but it's just to say that there is a long historical basis for gender diversity and sexual diversity in ways that we're just barely keeping up with now. And I want to say this also because I think that so much of the time, queer spaces are dominated particularly by white queers. And in doing so, they think that they'll often call it like, this is progress, this is progressive, moving forward. And to think that actually what they're doing most of the time isn't necessarily forging something new and moving something forward, but in fact, reaching back and borrowing and reclaiming often knowledge that has long been there. So just to think about the way power doesn't have to be like this linearly forward thing, but oftentimes it means necessarily looking back. And another thing to point out is like, we've all, or maybe many of us at least, have grown up hearing stories about Nana Bush, for example, and some of like our greatest spirits in our storytelling who are, when you pay attention, queer in some way. Right? That they are often seen as shapeshifters going from one form to another, or they aren't identified by any explicit gender marker. These are all ways that we can also see that in our most powerful beings, there is a reverence and an understanding of queerness there from the very foundations of our communities and our knowledges. Next slide, please. So, what about Two-Spirit specifically? I'm going to get into in the next section a little bit about how we got from that, what seemed to be so, understanding and fulsome and all of these things into where we are now. So there's a long history in between I'm skipping over, but I wanted to give you first a definition of Two-Spirit, understanding where it comes from. There's a bunch of different definitions you can find online. Some from the event where it was first created, which Myra Laramie, who I believe is a professor in the prairies right now at U Manitoba or U Winnipeg. And so she was the one who coined the term in the 1990s. And at the time, she said it was used to describe her feeling of having both male and female spirit. I think the definition has like evolved and taken new shapes and forms slightly over the years. The one I really like is this top one here, which says that Two-Spirit is an umbrella term that refers to individuals who are both Indigenous and queer in different ways that means to them. And it comes about because different nations each have different terms and conceptualizations of gender identity that are traditional to them. So Two-Spirit doesn't seek to override those, but rather recognize how much diversity there is. And so it can't be boxed into like a simple definition, which is something that once again, like when I'm doing these 2S 101 things, people like folks who come from like Western colonial backgrounds are like, what? I want a clear definition that I understand and is super legible. But I think that's also in itself what makes the term really radical and queer, right? Is that it refuses to be defined in ways that are legible to others. That's something that I think is really amazing about it. So as I mentioned, the creation of the term is attributed to Elder Myra Laramie, who proposed its use during the 3rd Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference, which is quite a conference title, I must say. I'm imagining an agenda with just like, in size 10 font. It was held in Winnipeg in 1990, which to put us also quickly into like international scale, like Two-Spirit is a term that is now used across the Americas, into sometimes in South America as well. There are mentions of it being used in England and other continents, and it started like right here, 8 hours away in Winnipeg. So just to say that, we have always been connected to queer people cross colonial borders and boundaries, and also have been pioneering in some ways, I hate that word, but have been forging, the trajectories of our communities for a really long time in a way that's really close to us. So the term is a translation of Anishinaabe-Moan, Nij Manaduak, meaning two spirits. And the way I had it described to me once, do folks know Jeremy Dutcher? Yeah, so the very amazing opera singer, Woolastook. And so he and I were at an event once, and he was talking about his teachings from queer folks who had been at this gathering in 1990. And they said that there was largely 2 reasons for its creation. And I think the second one especially gets overlooked. And so the first is that, of course, it was able to give language to a very particular experience and identity, where these Indigenous people, queer Indigenous people, were saying, I don't necessarily feel like I always belong in queer spaces, and I don't necessarily always feel like I belong in Indigenous spaces, and I don't really have language or something to rally around that I can, that I can use to reconcile that. And so they created Two-Spirit first and foremost as a community resource in that way, as that rallying point. But then also, and I think that this is really important as well, is that they use it as a term, and once there was a name, they could politically organize around it and ask for Two-Spirit funding, right? Ask for Two-Spirit events and services and all of these things. And before that point, they were maybe either, lots of folks would either have to feel that, okay, do I try and access services and resources specifically from an Indigenous perspective or specifically from a queer perspective, knowing that either would be imperfect, right? And so it gave, in a way, language also that was legible to people so that they could do those things. Next slide, please. So this is from Shanice Steele, who has a second E in her name, I'm realizing now as I look at this. Sorry, Shanice. But Shanice is a good friend of mine, queer, Afro-Indigenous, Métis, thinker and educator, and she has this like really beautiful piece that talks about also how she says she identifies specifically and deliberately as not two-spirit, but as indigiqueer or as Indigenous and queer. And the reason why she does that is, for example, it has to do with her personal teachings, which is what this quote refers to, which is where it says, when people explain that the term referred to someone who held two spirits within them, both masculine and feminine, this confused her because from the teachings she's received, every single one of us always carries masculine and feminine energies within us. Nobody can function without it. And so it doesn't make sense that it would be only queer people to have that, right? And so that was her understanding. But then moreover, it also was to talk about the way that two-spirit for her is a way to connect to the traditional understandings of queerness within her nation specifically. So what role did queer Indigenous people from her nations, what role did they traditionally have? And she did some research and found that that was a combination of a responsibility she didn't feel equipped to take on, and one that didn't speak to her. And so she said, maybe then this term isn't for me if that's what it needs to imply. So for a lot of people, like I said, there's different definitions, but two-spirit can often be also insinuating a set of obligations, right? To take up those traditional roles. This is not always the case. I don't think everybody abides by that definition, but it's one that Shanice was really attentive to. And so she said, I prefer indigiqueer instead. And so next slide, please. Look at that cute little baby Yoda. And so that's why it sparked a conversation about misconceptions also about the term two-spirit. And I think most of these misconceptions are just people assuming that there are hard and fast rules about the identity that, as I said, I don't necessarily think that they are, but it's important that we recognize them because they're often the way that two-spirit, queer, Indigenous people can become like really essentialized. So for example, that role of like, we had traditional, sacred, ceremonial roles. Alex Wilson, who is another queer Cree scholar on the prairies, talks about the way that sometimes that these people had really sacred high roles in community, and sometimes they were just like every other member of the community, right? And oftentimes saying that there is like almost this power about all queer Indigenous people was to romanticize what some people actually lived like and the diversity of experiences and roles we had traditionally for two-spirit queer people. And so it was just important to say that if that's something that people are called to, that yes, there's a historical basis there, but if it also isn't, that there is one for that as well. And so Marie Lang wrote this zine, you can find it online, about urban Indigenous queer people. And there's this one young person who's anonymous in it, but I think they put it perfectly where they said, to me, what two-spirit ultimately means is just that I would have been loved no matter what. No matter what I would have been like in that type of community and worldview and experience, I would have been loved, which is the, I think, heart of the thing, right? Like I said, not just one definition. Not all Indigenous people who are queer identify as two-spirit. And especially for Shanice, that was something that's really important. And most recently, I don't know if folks know Joshua Whitehead, wrote Johnny Appleseed and Full Metal Indigiqueer, and is like an amazing scholar, but just recently turned down an award for trans writers, while he says, I do identify as two-spirit, And oftentimes that can mean a trans experience. I am not a trans woman in the way that I feel that this award kind of is supposed to be for. And so I want to recognize also that just because I'm Two-Spirit doesn't mean that I can automatically stand in as a representative, right, for all of these different sort of identities. And he was saying, and especially as a person that's privileged in many ways, like that, does that take up a space for more marginalized folks within us? And so I thought that that was another more contemporary example of how people are trying to like expand the definition of Two-Spirit in people's minds. All right, next slide, please. So I want to now talk about those colonial underpinnings, again, of conceptions of gender and into contemporary struggles. Next slide, please. So colonial heteropatriarchy. What I was giving a talk to my students at TMU the other week, and it's wild how much things have changed, because 2 years ago, I was TAing and I asked, do you folks know what heteropatriarchy is? And they didn't. And then we was like, oh, awesome. Okay, we'll explain it, and talked. And then this year I was like, do we know what heteropatriarchy is? And they were like, yeah. And like, of course we do. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. The youth know what's up. So colonial heteropatriarchy talks about the way that colonialism and the tools and the systems of patriarchy also intersect to create the unique oppressions that queer Indigenous people face. So people often forget when we talk about the history of colonization, that if you're paying close attention, you can see the way that gender and sexuality were one of the very first things attacked, right? So if you've ever heard elders talk about and survivors talk about their experiences in residential school, you'll often hear stories, right, of being separated from their siblings on the basis of gender, being forced to dress a certain way or cut their hair or do all of these things. Those are ways that the agents of colonialism were enforcing gender, understandings of gender and sexuality onto children, right? When you think about the Indian Act, we often might talk about the way that there's like sexism inherently built in, but we also don't often talk about the way that queer folks in most cases were just made completely invisible, that there was absolutely no mention of queer folks in the original text of the Indian Act, just because it was a different form of oppression as opposed to explicit marginalization, which was invisibilization. They just said, we don't exist. And as such, you know, it also set the basis for questions that people are still dealing with about the identity today. And so when we think about the status system and, you know, 6-1 versus 6-2, what does that mean for queer couples, right, who can't have biological children signing birth certificates perhaps in these ways that straight people could? That is like one way that is not necessarily talked about the same way as like the marrying out rules and stuff like that, but which targets queer people. I've also heard, you know, stories of older trans elders who didn't know what it was when what's called the marrying out clauses were still in place, and had delayed a public transition for many years because they were worried if they did change their gender and in a like formal legal way, then it would also impact their status. And so there is all these different ways that are talked about way less about how the Indian Act specifically also targeted queer people. And so I think that's really important to mention. And the reason for all of this, why colonialism did this, of course, is because pushing rigid boundaries, living boldly in our identities, subverting Christian norms as well, it's threatening to the very foundations of colonialism, which are supposed to be, of course, mimicked of Western conceptions. So next slide, please. And by not recognizing this, it leaves queer, Indigenous, Two-Spirit people in this really precarious position. So in the contemporary LGBTQ rights movement, Indigenous people, you know, often cite feeling left out of queer spaces and conversations because, first of all, it's a space dominated not by us, but secondly, also, colonial versions of these liberation movements often center individual rights, right? So it's like the right to individually get married, to individually have kids, to own property, basically to replicate the traditional nuclear family, but just with queer people in it instead. Those are all not necessarily bad things, of course, but they don't also get at the nature of Indigenous struggle, which is a collective struggle, right? Which is one to say that Indigenous queer people cannot thrive without Indigenous rights broadly respected, collective rights, the rights to self-determination over our bodies, just as much as we can't from those individual queer ones. And so those compounded identities, intersectional, once again, make them particularly vulnerable to harm. And then the other thing is that because we often have we've been slow to take up in many ways and challenge oftentimes, not saying us specifically, but our communities at large, the internalized queer phobia that we learn from all of those years of colonization, we also replicate often the exact same types of harm. So when we hear, for example, about kin not being allowed in ceremony because they refuse to, sit on one side of the circle as opposed to the other. When we hear you can't come in unless you're wearing a certain dress or a certain skirt in that type of way. Those are all manifestations of colonialism under the guise of being traditional. And so it's important that we recognize the ways that we're continuing to replicate the systems of domination for the colonizer without them even asking us to. All right, and I'm into my last little section before I hand it over to Celine. So next slide, please. So I briefly want to talk about Indigenous futures and kind of set the stage for where we'll be going in the second half of this. And I believe also Celine has like a hands-on practice that we're going to be able to do at the end. So you won't just be sitting and listening to us talk for like 2 hours, which I appreciate. So the conversation of futurism is one that's like really exploded, I think, in recent years. Is built off of Afro-futurist practices, which, if you're not familiar, think like Black Panther, Wakanda, right? And so now Indigenous people have been doing that work as well, and alongside and in addition to. So you might think Prey, that new movie that came out, right? Very good, also, by the way. And many people cite that as an example of Indigenous futurism. And the definition of it that I really love comes from Erica Violet Lee, who says, for her, the practice of Indigenous futurisms is the practice of imagining all that our worlds could have been if it were not for the interruption of colonialism. And I think that is a really beautiful way to look at it, specifically that word interruption, right? Because it leaves so much room for futures beyond colonialism that we leave a lot of room for futurity there. So next slide, please. Like I said, I think it's important when we get into this practice of futurism that Celine will lead us through as well, that we don't have to just think about it as like uncharted territory, places we've never been before. It also is, I think in most cases, maybe even, a relearning, a remembering, revitalizing, and that is also a practice of futurity, right? Next slide. And I also briefly want to talk about the way that I think artists are kind of leading the charge on this for us. And so these are pictures of Jeremy on the far side, and then Kent Monkman here, both artists who are like, world renowned for what they create. And it was Jesse Wente who in 2018 at the ROM made this presentation. I was like, oh my God, that's such a great observation, is the way that, for example, like if you're familiar with Kent Monkman's art, and you can kind of see it in the back there, it's like Renaissance style painting, right? Which obviously does not come from here. It comes from Europe. Jeremy is a classically trained opera singer. Once again, coming not necessarily from here, but they've both taken these traditionally colonial, perhaps mediums, infused them with Indigenous worldviews, and made them something entirely more than the originators ever thought that they, could be. They've made them something completely transformative and new. And I think that that is just like a way of also showing, we might talk about like braiding worldviews together, right? And so it's something that I think artists especially have been doing and teach us to do very, very well. And so if we're doing it in art, of course, we can also start to think about the ways we can do it beyond just artist spaces. How could we do that in governance? How can we do that in education, in all of these different sort of sectors? I think clues have been left for us. And so that's the end of my bit. I was teasing an upward trajectory here at the end. So I would love to pass it off to my lovely, lovely friend, a Métis baddie, Celine, to do the second half of this. So miigwech, folks.
Hi, everybody. Okay. I'll just wait for it to pop up. Oh, my goodness. A little bit taller. Yeah, so Riley and I did have a plan and then I kind of deviated from that plan, but don't worry, it's going to be okay. Oh, no, it's okay. I lied to you. Okay. So like Riley said, I am going to be talking about how we can like dream and dreaming Indigenous queer futures. So I'll start off by introducing myself. So my name is Celine Wick. I recently received my name. So my name is Anankikwe, Star Woman, and I received my name from Ken Nash in Treaty 3. I'm Michif or Prairie Métis. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. My grandma was born in a Rhodolance community near Lestock, Saskatchewan, next to Mushkegowin. My family names are Belrose, LaFontaine, Vilbrun, and Gladue. It's very important for me to, I guess, root myself, explain who I am, just to demonstrate who I am, where I come from, the responsibilities I have. So I use the she, her pronouns. I identify as queer and I'm an auntie. So that kind of speaks to the types of responsibilities that I have. It also speaks to the responsibilities that queer Michif people had within our societies. And this is a photo of baby me in a head to toe Pocahontas outfit. Just a little bit of light trauma, but it's fine. Okay, so an overview. So I'm going to quickly talk about like the gendered processes of settler colonialism. I'm going to speak about, resistances or acts of love in relation to settler colonialism. There are a couple memes. There's not so many memes. I don't know if it's a bit cringe. I'm like an elder youth at this point, so I'm not sure if that's cringe, but whatever. I'll also talk about art as resistance, which Riley spoke about, and then talk about Indigenous queer futurism. And then we're going to do like a free writing or like a free dreaming creative kind of like space where you can have the chance to like dream what a queer Indigenous future looks like to you. And I have like paper and markers and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know why I agreed to go after Riley. I'm like, that was my choice. And then I was like, why did I do this? But anyway, it's gonna be fine. Thanks. Okay, so like Riley said, settler colonialism is this like big interwoven like web of structures. And so sometimes that can be hard to like think through our place within those big structures, which is why I think intersectionality is really important to think through, but also like naming these things. So settler colonialism, white supremacy, these structures of heteropatriarchy, the ways in which Christianity was mobilized to kind of like impart all of these identities on us, the imposed like nuclear family structures, which may not have been how our communities and nations like saw our kinship webs prior to. Jaza Morgan talks about this idea of like truth being a white man. So like the singular idea of truth, like one person's like voice matters, one person's idea of truth matters. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you think about like whose voices matter, whose stories have mattered, what constitutes truth, that kind of thing. So yeah, these were foreign structures that were imposed, but like Riley said, some became interwoven within our own families and communities and traditions. And this is like literally, oh, sorry, next one. This meme is like literally me because I'm doing my PhD right now. And I feel like it's just like me in a dark room, like thinking about colonialism and yeah. Okay. Next one, please. So what is gender? It's kind of like a really difficult thing to pin down, right? So I guess I'll talk about like what gender isn't. So gender is not determined by sex. Gender is understood through cultural context. Like, for example, what the idea of like what a woman is different based on like your community, your nation. Gender is separate from sexual orientation, and gender is personal, individual, fluid, and it may change over time. Next one, please. Thank you. Okay, so the gendered policies. Thank you. Okay, so the gendered policies of settler colonialism. So these were policies and like social norms that were imposed by the settler state. So these were all kind of informed by a idea of heteropatriarchy, and it forced this compartmentalization of our identities. So we were like these full, vibrant people, and like the settler state saw that and tried to like compartmentalize us and make us fit into their tiny boxes. So Scott L. Morganson talks about how gender and sexuality are not just a byproduct, but were necessary to the ongoing project of settler colonialism. So these were very important tools that the settler state used in order to like attack our relationships to ourselves, to the land, to each other. So there are many ways in which the settler state did this. Like one thing about the government, they're just like always in our business and they'll never get out of our business. And so something that is like very true in my family history was the idea of country wives. So these were Indigenous women who were like married to settler men. And there was a period in time when it changed from being like these men were adopted into our family structures, into our web of relations. And it changed as to where the women were then exploited. So like once the trader men, the settler men gained power, they no longer needed to like play by our social norms. And this kind of like, you can see it in the way in which like gender violence becomes normalized. Yeah, and it kind of like disrupted the way in which we like related to one another and like organize our families. Riley talked about like the Indian Act. So the gendered policies like were so overarching like in the Indian Act. So like in terms of like leadership, in terms of voting, in terms of like status rules, what she talked about. They were in our business in terms of like reproduction and parenting, in policing our sexuality and gender in like overt, but also like invisibilized ways. And it also interrupted our intergenerational knowledge transmission. So the devaluation of certain like knowledges which were seen as like gendered. Okay, so Quill Christie Peters. Thank you. I have like one job. Okay, so Quill Christie Peters talks about this idea of like spilling over. So this idea that our identities and our personhood, like as Indigenous people, are so expansive that they couldn't be contained by settler colonialism. They've always been like spilling over, she says. And I think that that's a really beautiful way to look at how expansive we still are, you know, in the same way that it's like settler colonialism is an interruption, is the same way that we've always been spilling over, we've always been creating, we've always been building new worlds. And then I also included this quote by Leanne Simpson. So struggle because we are occupied, erased, displaced, and disconnected. Struggle because our bodies are still targets for settler colonial violence. Struggle because this is the mechanism our ancestors engaged in to continuously rebirth the world. And our struggle is a beautiful, righteous struggle that is our collective gift to Indigenous worlds, because this way of living necessarily continually gives birth to ancient Indigenous futures in the present. So this idea that, yes, it is a struggle, but the struggle is a gift in that we're creating something new, but also remembering and sort of weaving those together to create a better life for ourselves, but also for future generations, and then reaching back to our ancestors as well. So resistance, acts of love. Indigenous peoples have and continue to resist the gendered processes of colonization in so many different ways. Yeah, I tried to make the list like less gushy than I would have initially liked. I also like left Riley off, even though she's in my heart, as are all of you. And yeah, so you know, it's like folks fighting for policy change, like Mary 2X Early, or Sandra Lovelace, or Jeanette Lavelle. Those women who created. Who fought really hard to create the amendments to the Indian Act, which like removed the bias towards gender and sex. Visual artists who create worlds and help us to dream different realities. So artists like Quill Christie Peters, Kent Monkman, musicians like Buffy St. Marie, Melody McIver, all of the, you know, countless land and water defenders, writers like Billy Ray Belcourt, Jazz M. Morgan, Jay Simpson, fashion designers like Scott Wabineau and Evan Ducharme. I'm lucky enough to be friends with Scott, and I feel like I literally see him every single time I go to this one gay bar in Toronto, and it's like it's like such a beautiful like meeting of like Indigenous like queer folks, and just like right in this like very urban setting, and it's really beautiful. Okay, so then I'll talk a little bit about art as resistance, because that's kind of what we're going to be doing. So 2SLGBTQ folks have always been creating and loving and making in lots of different ways. And I think that the idea of like art is very kind of like colonial in some senses, right? Like it's very like, you sit down, you create art, it's like separate from the other part of your life. And art can also be like a decolonial practice. Like it can be a process to work through things, to like show your love for the world. Like it can be so many other things than just like a commodifiable product. So it's also been used in terms of like protest and activism. It can be used to build community and worlds. It's an expression of ourselves, and it's a life-giving practice. There's lots of Indigenous drag performance. So there's like a long history of drag as you know, this gender expression, this political statement. Drag has always been political. And so there's a lot of really amazing Indigenous drag performers who bring parts of their culture, but also like show like these beautiful expressions of themselves and parts of themselves. It's a way to reclaim our bodies and our sexualities, our stories and our futures. It's also a way to help other Indigenous folks see themselves in the world, right? Like if you see somebody wearing like a shirt by Scott or like a mobilized shirt or something like that, right? Like we can see ourselves in each other. It can also be a way to communicate these really complex ideas in engaging ways. Like I said, like I'm a PhD student, and sometimes we can like over intellectualize these things that our people like understood very like in embodied ways, like they just were like living and doing, and we have to like make these into like very like elite kind of like intellectual ideas. That's not necessary. So I find that art is really a good way of communicating things like that. So these are just some examples of art, queer art that I really loved. Thank you. Okay, poetry. So I love poetry. Thank you again. I love poetry. There were a lot of different poems that I wanted to include, but they were not family friendly PG. But I would recommend checking out like Neil Campbell, Billy Ray Belcourt, these poets who speak about these like really vulnerable things, their dreams, their experiences in such relatable and ways in which we can see ourselves and our communities in these poems, which is so important, right? Like not only is representation important, it's like you can dream a future that's not so sad, right? Because often like as Indigenous queer people, we're told that like the future is not perhaps as bright as we know that it is. Yeah, so I'll just read out the one by Billy Ray Belcourt. So a poem is a funhouse with warped mirrors. From it, one gleans a distorted image of oneself. A poem, however, isn't a mirror. A mirror wants nothing for itself. A poem, a surface to boomerang, a future history, a future past. So you might be writing a poem, and it might be a mirror. Okay, so just expanding a little bit about Indigenous futurism. So it's funny because I actually was thinking about it as like explaining it as Nietzsche Wakanda. So the fact that you use that, I was like, oh, so true. And I love that we came to the same conclusion. Yeah, so Billy Ray Belcourt wrote, you know, to be queer and native and alive is to repeatedly bear witness to worlds being destroyed over and over again. But I like to think that it's also to witness and create new worlds over and over again, right? Because in that like destroying, there's also like a creation or a rebirth. I remember when I came out in high school, my mom immediately, her reaction was like, oh, like, I'm so afraid for what your future is going to be like it's going to be so sad. And like, that's fair, but that's also not true. Like, I'm going to have a really amazing, fun future. And I want that to be true for like queer youth. Like when you are thinking about your future, I want it to be like, so fun and joyous and exciting. And so that's what futurism like kind of allows us to do. It's a way to reclaim our own futures, to dream and make possible a future free from settler colonial violence and interference, to think past like that interruption. So it's dreaming and visioning and planning. So we might not have that many examples of queer adulthood. So it's important to be able to imagine our beautiful and joyful and loving futures. It's also very disruptive to settler colonialism, which I love. So securing a joyful queer future is an act of reclamation. As Bell Hooks said, you know, love is the practice of freedom. And to be truly free, we must work from an ethic of love in order to reject the ethics of domination. So that's why I think that like dreaming and art is so beautiful, because it's so easy to be angry. But if we think about like creating and dreaming and yeah, that it's like so much, it'll sustain us for much longer than anger will, I think. And we want to be here forever and always. So dreaming is strategic, it's planning, it's organizing, and it's mobilizing. Okay, so now we are at the part where you guys get to do stuff. So we're gonna have a dreaming break. So Indigenous futurisms allow us to dream joyful, expansive, loving, brilliant futures. And we can take parts of our traditions and our cultures and dream beyond our current realities. So I want you to take some time and think about like, what does an Indigenous, queer, or two-spirit future look like for you? So you could write a poem, you could do some spoken word, you can write down song lyrics, do a little drawing. I have some crayons. You could write a letter to your future self, like what you're gonna look like in the future, or the land or your ancestors. You could do some meme making if you want. So what time are we at? Okay, so like 30, 40 minutes, I guess, yeah. So I'll bring around some paper, some crayons, and I have this up as like, okay, if you go to the next, thank you. So I have this up as like inspiration. These are some things that kind of like inspired me. You don't have to use this as your inspiration. You could do whatever you want. You could Google art. You could think about your family, like whatever you want to do. And it can be like just for yourself, or if you want to share it like with your table or whatever, that's cool too. So yeah, I'll bring around some stuff. besties. Hello, everyone. Okay, so I heard a lot of conversation. I saw a lot of drawing. So that's awesome. Does anyone feel like compelled to share anything that they made or talk about anything? It's okay if not. You want 5 more minutes? Okay, yeah. No problem. Does anybody want to share? Anybody online want to share? Anyone feel called to share? Again, you don't have to. Okay, Slay.
Hello. I wrote a letter to my future self. It goes, Dear future Alec, hey Alec, this is past Alec. I just wanted to tell you you are doing amazing. What you're doing is what I wish I had growing up. I wish I had an advocate in the reserve to look up to that is in the LGBTQIA community. Someone to talk to when I had nobody. Past Alec is always there for his friends. I hope you're still the person that anyone can go to when things are rough. I know you're an empath, and I hope that you learn how to control your feelings and how to feel other people's feelings. You're amazing. You have amazing gifts to share with the world. Everything you're doing is great. Please don't stop what you're doing. Love, past Alec.
That was so good. Does anybody else want to share? Okay, yes, another one. Yeah.
Hello. Okay, so mine is kind of not like a future self, but kind of like a photo of the present self right now, just because of everything that's been going on with these events. So it's kind of just like all these little boxes. There's me and the rainbow, and then but it just like experiences like reflecting this past couple of days on the gender boxes that you're kind of forced to fit into. And then these are just like the little boxes kind of broken up, you know, through this experience. And just kind of like navigating these experiences, and then also trying to accept that parts of myself, because it's still very new to me. Like it's always something that was present, but something that I myself have not really accepted and still struggle with accepting. But yeah, I don't know, just what I did for today.
That was awesome. Anybody else? Okay, Slay.
So this isn't really, I don't know necessarily how to qualify this, but it is a retelling of an interaction I had at a conference where I was talking about liberated futures, and this old lady was very skeptical of me. And so the old woman at the conference is skeptical of my argument. She says, "You talk a lot about liberation like you are certain of her. How could I not be? I worry," she says, "people are addicted to negativity, always looking for the things that are wrong. I wonder, does she not think that that has to always be someone's role?" She says, "Even if we did reach some so-called liberation, would we even know? Would we even accept that we had arrived?" I tell her, of course, liberation, the future, isn't promised. If we're there, it's because we built it brick by brick by brick. When we reach liberation, we know because we birthed her, we raised them, we continue to protect him. We will know we've arrived because of the journey that brings us together. And so that is the retelling.
Why is sex a taboo? It's not a taboo. It is a gift from God. It is intense. It is extremely gratifying. Most of all, it brings peace. contentness, and calmness. Guess what? Cooking sex is the best. Sex gets better as we get older. It don't stop at 40 like I thought. It gets 100 times more better. It takes us to the spirit world. Spirit world is where we all are headed. It is where I want to be. Miigwech.
Oh my goodness, I'm so happy with everybody's sharing. It's so awesome. Does anybody else want to share? Yeah, okay.
I really liked your drawing of the little boxes. It's kind of like really similar to what I wrote about. I don't know what to call it yet, but it's just something that came out. I bent to your world, but I did not fit. Pieces of me broke, and you laughed as you saw the pieces fall. I awkwardly kicked away the pieces, forgetting it ever existed, forgetting I ever existed. But I kept bending for you, walking carefully in your world, still breaking pieces of myself, breaking, hiding, breaking, hiding, breaking, hiding, until I look and act like you. I miss me. You made me hate me. But as I pick up my pieces, I say, oh, how beautiful. Oh, how welcoming, how warm, how I've missed you. My pieces make me feel like home. So call me the architect of myself.
Gosh, this, oh, yes, another one.
I just started coloring in the book that we were given for the event package, but around it, I started integrating words around the flower, and I wrote words like openness, growth, journey, confidence, strength, resilience, love, learning, new, change, and difference. And I'm just really grateful to be here and have the opportunity to join everyone today. So thank you.
I'm not done. I think because of our journeys, they're never really finished. Even in spirit, we continue on. And so I just drew a bunch of words as well. And I was here for moral support. But I have 2S, I have safe space, I have authentic, I have blissful pride, peace, inclusive, I have truth, Debwewen, love, Zagadwin. And I was writing about humility. Humility is we're no better than, we're no less than, but we're all together. So, Chimigwach.
Yay, I love how you guys supported each other. That was so cool. Okay, last chance. Anyone? Oh my goodness, yes, okay.
Hello. So I drew a drawing of what I want to see in the future, which is a two-spirit hero in the Marvel universe, which I think would be very cool. I drew a wolf as their guide, which I thought would be cool to incorporate because my clan is wolf.
Hello. I did a series of 4 memes because I like memes, and most of them have Pokemon because I like Pokemon. But the first one is it's got Eevee in the middle, has earrings on, like beaded earrings, and it says, "This is me. This is the indigenous creature. When you hurt me, this is the indigenous creature you are hurting," and has a rainbow tail. The next one is not done being colored in, but it's like blueberries and wild rice and strawberries and fuzzy peaches. And says, "If you are what you eat, then this two-spirit is medicine and fuzzy peaches." And then the bottom one is a very poorly drawn eagle, like very, very poorly drawn, and a possum, the screaming one. It says, and they're under the northern lights, and it says, "Both my spirits resisting colonial heteropatriarchy through Canada." And then the last one is the surprise Pikachu, and it says, "The colonizers' faces when they realize me and the other two spirit youth are thriving."
All right, mine is also not done. We had to, I guess it's like a little bit of a poem. I don't know. I'm not really good at sharing my vulnerabilities, but we had to bury our sacred items in the land to avoid the flames that the colonizers brought. We buried our identities just the same. We cannot pretend to be something we're not. One by one, we rise from the soil. We are the defenders, the leaders, the helpers, the caretakers, the providers, the artists, and the teachers. We are what our communities need. And then I don't have anything else.
Hi, everyone. Just want to introduce myself as well. My name is Melody McIver. I'm here on behalf of Treaty 3, where I'm representing our Mizowayamakut Two-Spirit Council, which is part of now the Treaty 3 traditional governance model. And various hats that I wear. I used to be a youth worker in Sioux Lookout, chasing after some of you kids. I'm now a musician and a professor living in Winnipeg, but it's really great to be back in Northwestern Ontario. I miss trees a lot. And in terms of what I wanted to think about for futures, I definitely got distracted visiting since I wasn't here yesterday, but Treaty 3, we've organized Two-Spirit powwows the last 2 summers, which has been fun and a great learning curve. And for myself, I'm a grass dancer. I'm starting work on woodlands as well, but my most pressing future goal is that I feel like we're getting a lot more space now for Two-Spirit dancers, and I want to continue working towards just degendering dance categories. If you want to dance jingle, grass is grass. And moving forward, I'd really love to see more support and encouragement from the round dance singer community, the powwow singer community, where I don't see very many Two-Spirit people specifically having access to the big drums and being able to participate in learning our songs and building on our vocabulary as a musician, something that's really close to me. And in the powwow circle, I'm a dancer, even though I know every other hat I wear is always connected to music. So, thank you much.
Okay. Is there anyone online that wants to share? Yes? Oh, yes. Okay.
Bonjour, Ani, Jimalina Dishnakas, Nijni and Manaduag, Kukutush Ibing and Anishinaabe. My name is Jamie Lee. I'm from the Groundhog River, currently known as Flying Post First Nation in Treaty 9 territory. I'm Ojibwe and Irish. I'm super excited to be here, even though it's online today, to share with other Two-Spirit from the north specifically. I lived in Toronto for a couple of years, but I'm back home in Treaty 9 now. So I have a little poem that I wrote during the break. What is time even? Is time a circle? Is time change? Is time looking into the future? Is time looking into the past? Is time living right now? In a different time, I was kept in the closet for decades. In a different time, my little cousin came out at 7 with pride. In a different time, what is time even? Miigwech.
That was awesome. Okay, anyone else before we close out? Okay, well, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate that. So yeah, just a reminder that joy is resistance, art is resistance, love is resistance, and dreaming is resistance. So Marcy, Chimigwech, and that's my email if you guys want to get in contact with me. Thank you.
Miigwech, that was amazing. I love that we have this beautiful safe space to express, and I encourage you to take those moments in your life to dream. We just had a small moment, and I encourage you to bring that out more in yourself. Create that safe space for yourself and share it with others if you feel compelled to. I think it is very important. Dreaming and expressing is a form of our resistance. So it is lunchtime and I smell the food. It smells real good. So Monet, if you could come up and we'll do a prayer over the food and then we'll meet you. So eat.
Manitu, kagagwedjmen jui jishnam, che we jishnam nungum gagi gagawi we sniang, mijum, iwede, che mashkawiziang nungum ga shkwana quick, kakina gavin watch we snwatch guanok, kigayashmago gagin manitu, peshake gungaminago. Oyanga kagwedjmache, Jestitutra Kajing. Great Spirit, thank you for the food we are about to eat. We are very grateful for the food and for the fellowship of today. Remember when we're eating to think about the things that we have. If there's a lot of meat in there, you remember where it came from and to enjoy whatever you can. And if you're not a meat eater, then whatever is out there, you think about the food and think about your belly, your body. We're nourishing ourselves, and that's what we're doing today here. We're not eating food. We're sharing our food in us, who we are in words. I'm not very good at saying big words, but I'm good at little words. I didn't go to school long enough. And I'm so happy and proud to see these young people working together, doing things they are doing. I know one day they're going to be really good leaders, and we need more leaders, especially young people. Miigwech. I'm going to take my little smudge and just go around here because I didn't do that this morning. You don't have to feel like you need to smudge unless I bring it to you or whatever. But go get your food and I'll do my walk around with the smudge.